Welcome to 2017 at Asia Society. And my name is Bunty Chand, and on behalf of Asia Society India Center, we'd like to welcome you to our first program of the year. And hopefully there'll be many more after this. Today's program is very interestingly named by a very young program officer, A Tale of Two Countries. And as you know, we have our speakers here, Christophe Jaffrelot and Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, and maybe Christophe will have a comment about the title. I'm not sure about that. Because I think it covers much more than just two countries. Yeah. But I think what was very interesting was when we were exchanging notes with Christophe was that he thought he would speak today to us about Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and talk about the various geopolitical, transnational, and religious linkages between these countries. And, it makes for a serious discussion, and it would be interesting to hear what impact it has on all the other Asian countries. And just a few words about the Asia Society. We are 60 years old around the world, and we have 12 global offices that promote collaboration and exchange across and within Asia Pacific. And as you all know, we work in the areas of business and policy and arts and culture. And we use creative formats to present cross-disciplinary perspectives, fresh insights, informed ideas, and an independent and non-partisan view on Asian and world affairs. And what we want to do is we want to explore vital issues facing Asia on the global stage. We want to create awareness and effect change. And the India Center is 10 years old and in Mumbai, and we can legitimately claim a modest contribution to the public discourse in the city on policy, business, culture, and arts. And last but not the least, we are a membership organization. So it's support from you members that helps us be operational in India. So if you're not a member, I'd really request you to become a member. And it is very, very reasonable, the annual membership of the Asia Society. And before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to give you, I want to give them a flavor of who's out there, what the audience is all about. So very simple, straightforward question. How many of you think that the global oil prices will fall further in the next few months? 10%? Okay. Okay, the next question is, how many of you think that the growing Pakistan and China friendship is a cause of worry for India? Okay. Brief introduction about our speakers here this evening. Christophe Jaffrelot, he's Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute and Research Director at the CNRS. And he also teaches South Asian Politics and History at Sciences Po and is an Overseas Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. And he has several research interests, including theories of nationalism and democracy, mobilization of the lower castes and untouchables in India, and the Dargah culture, and the relations between businessmen and politicians in India, with special reference to Gujaratis. I find that very interesting. Yes. And Pramit, of course, Christophe has come from, I don't know which part of the world at the moment, but Pramit has come from Delhi, and he was a 2007 Bernard Schwartz Fellow, and he's a member of Asia Society's Global Council. And so we have a very old association with Pramit. And he's also the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, and distinguished fellow and head of strategic affairs at the Ananta Aspen Center. And he also works for a couple of private advisory groups, Rhodium Group and Bauer Group. And he, very interestingly, served as a member of the Indian government's National Security Advisory Board from 2011 to 2014. And now Christophe will give some remarks, and then he'll have a discussion with Pramit, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bunti, for this kind introduction and for this fourth or fifth invitation. I always say yes. And thank you also. I want also to thank my alma mater, Sciences Po, which is well represented in the room today and which is doing such a good job in connecting India and France more intensively via students who are the future of both countries. Yes, the remarks I'm going to present, and I have a rather large bunch of papers here because I'm really working on it now, are related to these relations between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And of course, I did not imagine when we decided to select this topic for today that it would be that topical, as you've noticed, even though it has not been that publicized in the Indian press, but I'm sure you've noticed that 2 days ago, Raheel Sharif, only 2 months after retiring as Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan, has been invited by the Saudis to lead a new alliance, IMAFT, the Islamic Military Alliance to fight terrorism. It suggests, even though he has not accepted formally the invitation yet, it suggests that these two countries have such strong relations that an ex-chief of army staff can join at the invitation of another country, something to my mind unprecedented, a kind of NATO or a version of NATO that is regional. We'll see whether you will accept, but I'll return to that in the conclusion. In spite of the impression of proximity between the two countries that this suggests, I'd like to qualify the quality of the relations between these two countries. And in the first part of my presentation, I will look at this relationship from the Pakistani point of view in some historical perspective. Has Saudi Arabia been part of the Pakistan project? What have been the relations between these two countries till the 80s? By the 80s, we know they became very close. But what about the previous decades? I will have a kind of overview that will help us to qualify the relationship. And in the second part of this presentation, I will look at the challenges of today and show why the quality of the relationship should not be overestimated. When you look back to the Pakistan movement and to the first decades of the history of Pakistan, you do not see Saudi Arabia as playing a key role. Of course, because of Mecca and Medina, because of the Hajj, and because of the fact that Ashraf always claim that they come from the family of the Prophet, something Sayyid Ahmed Khan himself said. Of course, for all these reasons, there is a look west tendency among aristocratic elites of the Muslims before independence. But it's not so much there in the mind of the architects of Pakistan. One very interesting case is, of course, Iqbal himself. Iqbal, who is probably the ideologue or the philosopher, the poet-philosopher, who has initiated the idea of Pakistan and elaborated upon this idea, related to Saudi Arabia before it even existed in a very emotional manner. And there is no doubt that he placed the Arabian homeland at the center of his poetry. In one of his poems, he writes, "What does it matter if my wine jar is Persian? At least the one is Arabian, Hijazi. What matters if the song is Indian, Hindi? The tune, after all, is Arabian, Hijazi." So this idea comes repeatedly in his poetry. The cradle of Islam is in Saudi Arabia, and we must pay allegiance to it. And at the expense of the other legacy, that is the Persian legacy. And I'll return to that because, of course, one of the big questions is, should Pakistan turn towards Saudi Arabia or should Pakistan turn towards Iran? So he has this sympathy, and this is an understatement, for the Arabian legacy of Islam, and he defines Islam on the basis of this identity up to a point. When he becomes the thinker of the Pakistan project in the 30s, he keeps distance. And he says in his Muslim League address, 1930, when the idea of a separate homeland for Indian Muslims really takes shape, he says, "These demand, Pakistan, even though the name is not there yet, is, I quote, for Islam, an opportunity to rid itself of the stamp of Arab imperialism, to mobilize its law, its education, its culture, and to bring them into closer contact with its own original spirit and with the spirit of modern times." He is a modernist. He doesn't believe in Wahhabism. He doesn't believe that Saudi Arabia is showing the way. Pakistan will have its own way. And in fact, very soon after, in a book that was called The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, he describes Wahhabism as conservative, backward-looking. Pakistan will be different. So in the work of the first main proponent of Pakistan, you don't see the Saudi homeland playing a big role. Well, the successors of Iqbal, those who will really build Pakistan, Jinnah, Liaquat Ali Khan, will follow in the same direction. And it's very interesting to look at what happened in the 40s, before partition, after partition, when they thought about who would be approached, who will be the partners, who will be the friends, and what will be the model, what will be what Liaquat Ali Khan calls the laboratory. Pakistan will be a laboratory, the first Islamic republic. What will be the model? The model will not be Saudi Arabia. In fact, the idea there in the 40s is to take the lead and be the leader of the Muslim world. Jinnah tours the Middle East in December 46. He goes to Egypt and suggests that a worldwide Islamic League should be created. And the idea is also suggested to Saint John Philby, the father of another Philby, who was at that time the advisor of King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. The idea of having an Islamic, worldwide Islamic League originated in the mind of the architects of Pakistan. And in 49, after partition is a fait accompli, Khalid-ud-Zaman, who is the president of Muslim League, says publicly something very important, that Pakistan will bring together all Muslim countries into Islamistan, a pan-Islamic entity. And he had just said before, Pakistan is only the jumping off ground. The time is not far distant when the Muslim countries will have to stand in line with Pakistan. And then only the jumping ground will have reached its fruition. So we are building Pakistan. It is the new laboratory for the Muslim world, and others will fall in line. We'll be the leaders. Well, of course, nothing of that kind happened. But it did not happen for good reasons. It happened because the moment Pakistan joined hands with the US, the main supporter of Israel, it alienated many Muslim countries. And of course, the turning point is the joining of CENTO and CETO when the Saudi Arabia ambassador reacted to by saying, well, that was really stabbing us in the back. So relations with the Saudis were severed at that time in the 50s. It became very clear that Pakistan will not be the leader of the Muslim world. And Saudis, on the contrary, pushed in that direction. And 62, they create the Muslim World League, and 69, the Islamic Organization Conference. They take the lead. And then Pakistan will run after this group. Of course, not so much in the 60s. In the 60s, interestingly, the Arab milieu being close to Pakistan, they turned to Turkey and Iran. And there is this very interesting sentence by Ayub Khan, who took over in 58, when he said, "What is the origin of the Turks, Iranians, Afghans, and Pakistanis? We have all the same origins, the steppes of Central Asia. So we are of the same stock." And in the 60s, he will build a new coalition with Turkey and Iran. So it's not in the 60s that Pakistan will run after Saudi Arabia. It's in the 70s. And the turning point, of course, is the 71 war, when Saudi Arabia will come to the rescue of Pakistan. The US did not do much. China did not do much. Saudi Arabia supported massively Pakistan with a $20 million loan. And even after, well, immediately after it took over, Bhutto will tour the region to collect money and collect support to build what will be known the Islamic bomb. And the kind of trade-off starts at that time. Pakistan will get money from Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan will give military support and security to Saudi Arabia. In fact, there is a very interesting visit of General Tika Khan, the Pakistani Chief of Army Staff, in 72, where he met King Faisal, and the deal is probably made at that time when the idea is to send military personnel to Saudi Arabia. We will have up to 20,000 military officers and soldiers in Saudi Arabia coming from Pakistan for helping, for protecting Pakistan in these years. And that will continue. March 79, very important moment. 79, Mecca is under siege. Who comes to the rescue of the Saudis? The French, of course, but also the Saudis and the Pakistanis. And the Pakistanis will be publicized as those who have saved the holy cities of Medina and Mecca from this siege that was, in fact, orchestrated by those who looked at the Saudis as lackeys of the US and therefore infidels. So it's interesting, Pakistan helping Saudi Arabia to retain the friendship of the US. The security dimension of the collaboration will never stop, and it will become much more substantial after Zia will take over. And in the case of Zia, we have, of course, a kind of point of no return that is reached. We have a kind of Arabization of Pakistan. And you can say even Saudi Arabization of Pakistan. Of course, in terms of education, with madrasas developing very quickly with Saudi support, so far as the Sunni madrasas are concerned, but also in terms of law. And something that is not very, very well known is that Saudi Arabia sent people to draft some of the ordinances Zia will issue. For instance, the Zakat and Ushr ordinance was written by Maruf Dualibi, who had been sent by King Faisal himself. This is a time also when you have the Islamic International Islamic University in Islamabad that will have in Islamabad in the premises of the Faisal Mosque, where Zia will be buried, its own education publicized. Have with Zia a pro-Saudi policy that will, of course, fructify even more during the Afghan jihad. And that is opening a new chapter, because the Afghan jihad will result in the collaboration of many Arab jihadists, including Azam, who was the founder, in fact, of the Salafi movement, Saudi-supported Salafi movement in Pakistan in the 70s, and of course, bin Laden, who will come in the early 80s and will receive the support of both CIA and ISI. With the Afghan jihad, anti-Soviet Afghan jihad, we reach a point when jihadi groups will get support from Saudis. You can't say the Saudi state, because there is almost nothing like that. You have families and tribes giving to charities, supporting themselves, madrasas and groups. But this is clearly a policy. There is clearly a policy behind that will gradually build a kind of hyphen between both countries. And therefore, it is not so surprising that by the 80s, you can say these two countries have now come to a deep understanding. And Pakistan has chosen Saudi Arabia against Iran. Of course, in a context that is dominated by the revolution of Khomeini, Pakistan is one of the places where the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran is happening at his worst, with sectarianism developing and Zia supporting Sunni groups against Shia pro-Iranian groups. Well, in spite of this background that I wanted to recollect, and because of the difficult beginnings that I have emphasized, harking back to Iqbal, it's not so clear today that Pakistan is necessarily the creature or puppet of Saudi Arabia. And I'm going now to turn to the challenges of today for the country, listing all the pros, militating in favor of this proximity, but I'll end with a long list of cons saying there'll be problems, and there are problems already. Well, what the two countries have in common remains very much in terms of security. There is no doubt that these two countries have one common security agenda. They, at least to put it in a better perspective, they have mutual interest in terms of security. Do you know, for instance, that Saudi Arabia is the largest importer of Pakistani arms? Yes, there is something like a Pakistani industry manufacturing arms, and that's somewhat in contrast with what we have in India. Pakistan is selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and it was so much effective that in spite of small numbers of deals, Saudi Arabia is the largest importer of Pakistani arms in 2016. And of course, they do joint maneuvers, and some of the most recent joint maneuvers took place in March 2016. It was called Northern Thunder, and these military exercises took place in Saudi Arabia, and everybody attended it. The Chief of Army Staff, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, everybody had to be there. Security. And security towards whom? Well, of course, towards India, when the Saudis give money to the Pakistanis to buy arms, but it's also against Iran and the friends of Iran in the region, when the Pakistanis are helping the Saudis to upgrade their army. And it is jointly against some Islamist groups. Clearly, ISIS has become a common target of both, in spite of some ambiguities, and I'll return to that, because when you enter Islamism, you have the pros and the cons, always. And it's a very fuzzy, gray area. But that's clearly one of the things Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are doing together, security-related affairs. Secondly, of course, there is a big interest on the Pakistani side in the remittances Pakistani workers sent back home. You know, these remittances last year represented $20 billion, and most of it came from Saudi Arabia. It was a huge proportion that came from Saudi Arabia, and if you add up Saudi Arabia and the UAE, you end up with something like $13 billion, something Pakistan badly needs given its financial situation. So that's one more link. Third, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that is still Saudi-led, supports Pakistan in multilateral agencies, fora, for instance, so far as the Kashmir issue is concerned. There have been ups and downs on that front, and in the 60s, when the Saudis were not too happy with the Pakistanis, who were seen as too pro-American, they stopped supporting Pakistan in the UN on the Kashmir issue. But things have changed, and in August, the Secretary of the OIC has reiterated his support for the need of a referendum, a plebiscite in the Indian Kashmir, as they say. Fourth, there are close links between one section of the political personnel of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Nawaz Sharif family is a case in point. Nawaz Sharif went to Saudi Arabia, to Jeddah, for 7 years in exile after the military coup by Musharraf. He has established very close connections, business connections as well in Saudi Arabia. And a member of the Saudi royal family, the grandson of King Fahd, married his daughter, Nawaz Sharif's daughter, which is not something unimportant. And he has been somewhat rewarded for this proximity by receiving gifts, one of them $1.5 billion in 2014. The personal relations of this camp, this family, the Sharifs, on the one hand, and the Saudi aristocracy is clearly another reason why they can't say no. These are the pros, and I'm turning to the cons. Why? It's not for sure that the rapprochement will result in a real complicity. Well, first of all, when the PPP is in office, it's a different story. When the PMLN, Nawaz Sharif party is in office, the pro-Saudi policy is taken for granted. When the PPP is in office, it's a completely different story. And when Zardari was president of Pakistan, he made sure that relations improved with Iran. You know, there is a strong suspicion that the Bhuttos are Shias anyway. They are probably not, but Zulfikar married an Iranian woman. By implication, Shiism made somewhat inroads in this family, and that was something the Saudis could not accept. And it's true that for that reason, or also because of his own personal leanings, Zulfikar and the rest, and of course Zardari, went closer to Iran. When you look at the Sindhis at large, the Sindhi nationalists or the Sindhis at large are resenting the Arab influence. And there is a famous book by Echaz Hassan, the former minister of Benazir's government, the Indus Saga. It's a fascinating book when you see that he minimizes as much as he can the 144 years when Arabs dominated Pakistan, because he says Pakistan was there before Pakistan. Yeah, we were conquered. That's the only. The rest is ours. We don't have anything to do with the Saudis, Arabs. So that's one qualification. And of course, PMLN is ruling today, but it may not be forever. Secondly, I have no time for that, but I would like to emphasize this. There is a strong resilience of the Sufi culture, the Sufi traditions, the Sufi legacy of the Islamic tradition, South Asian Islamic tradition in Pakistan. And this is, of course, resisting the Wahhabization. For instance, the way the cult of saints, as the Wahhabis would say, continue at the time of Urs in almost each and every dargah, in Sindh, but not only in Sindh, South Punjab, many other places, shows that this culture is still there. And that's a kind of antidote to Saudi Arabization. Another third reason why, and I turn to the establishment now, it is not so clear that both countries are on the same page, is the support the Saudis are giving to some groups, extremists, the army itself in Pakistan is trying to contain. Now, Sunni sectarian groups, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for instance, is a case in point. There are many pieces of evidence showing that some Saudi sources are helping these very militant Sunni sectarian groups that the Pakistani army itself is trying to contain, because they don't want sectarianism to become such a huge issue. So they're not on the. That's why when you say Islamism, you have to be very careful, because my good Islamist cannot be yours, and they may be your bad Islamist. So these groups can be the good Islamist of the Wahhabis. They are not the good Islamist of Pakistan, which has its own good Islamists, who will be sometimes common to Saudi Arabia, the Haqqani network, or LET, sometimes different. So that's, of course, complicated and somewhat opaque, but very important. Fourth, and this is the most important thing, Iran. And that's my last but most important point here. Pakistan cannot bow to Saudi Arabia because of Iran. Because of sectarianism, of course, but also because of Iran. And you can't delink both. It's part of the same story. it's very difficult to take side in this conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran for not only the Pakistani government, but the Pakistani army itself. Well, for many reasons, I don't want to go into the details, but if Pakistan alienates Iran, it pushes Iran in the arms of India and others. And the making of the Shabawar port may become a reality. If Pakistan alienates Iran, it also makes the grand project of one route, one belt of China more difficult. And it is not in its interest at all when CPEC is the motto of Pakistan these days. And this is why in 2015, when the Yemen war started, Pakistan said no to Saudi Arabia. And this no, there is a book called The Japan which says no, a book, very old book, saying that some countries sometime have to say no to their masters. In the case of Japan, it was the US, of course. And they have not said a big no. The Pakistanis could not say a big no either, but they made sure that the army would not be involved in this conflict. And after many weeks of consulting each and everybody, the government asked the parliament to vote on this question, and it unanimously said, we will not go there. We will make sure to defend the holy cities of Saudi Arabia. We will protect the territory of Saudi Arabia, but we will not support Saudi Arabia militarily elsewhere. And that takes me to the decision or the proposal that has been made 2 days ago. Saudi Arabia is back with the same demand indirectly. They're not asking Pakistan to send troops, but they're asking the last chief of army staff to take the lead. What does it suggest? Does it suggest that, well, now Pakistan is forced to say yes? Or is it a kind of, I would say, emergency decision that the young Salman, the new Minister of Defense in Saudi Arabia, has made? No, it's too early to say. It's a very important moment. The decision that will be made eventually will be an important decision. You can certainly infer or speculate that the Saudis are seeing Iran winning in Syria, and they are not winning in Yemen after 2 years, almost. So you need to force the destiny by having your wild card played, and Pakistan is the wild card of Saudi Arabia in the region. It's a kind of poker like decision, because if the government of Pakistan says we don't want our ex-chief of army staff to do that, then it will be a real break. I mean, very difficult to damage control after that. And it's not impossible. We will see. The defense minister of Pakistan has just repeated that Pakistan committed itself to defend the integrity of Saudi Arabia, not more than that. And of course, you can read in between the lines, but I'm sure we will continue in that direction, what it means for India, because the implications of either a pro-Saudi policy or an anti-Saudi decision will have for this country when the Gulf matters so much in India these days. But I stop here.
Let me begin by asking a question about India. As you know, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in roughly his first year in office, completely ignored what Indians call West Asia. Since then, however, he has visited the United Arab Emirates, he has visited Qatar, he has visited Saudi Arabia, he has visited Iran, and he has invited, in a Chief Republic Day guest, will be the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, a family that has never been invited to or has ever come as a guest of Republic Day before. In addition, these countries, especially the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, have pledged to invest, combined together, at least $80 billion into Indian infrastructure. And we have a Saudi Arabia that is strangely wooing India, much, I think, to somewhat India's surprise. How would you analyze this, given the fact that the UAE, Pakistan, and Kuwait have traditionally had a very special relationship with Pakistan? Why is India suddenly a matter of interest to them?
Well, in fact, it's in continuation with what I've just said, because you can connect the dots and certainly consider that the no of 2015 was such a shock, not only for Saudi Arabia, but for the UAE also. UAE were pissed off, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of UAE said, how do you dare? How do you dare to say no when we are pouring money? That's not said, but that's the subtext. When we are pouring money in your defense apparatus for decades. So I think these countries can now turn to India also because of this push factor. You know, there is a push factor. There is a kind of disappointment with Pakistan. This disappointment, by the way, is very similar in a different manner to the one the Americans are feeling. They have invested in Pakistan dozens of billions of dollars for so many years, expecting from this country that it will deliver. But there is a very fascinating sentence in Ayub Khan's memoirs when he says, I'm used to play one lion against another. And that's exactly what Pakistan is doing all the time. They don't deliver. They take the money and they do something else with it. And if this one stops giving, someone else will probably do the job. So in that particular case, there is a kind of resentment, disappointment. That's the push factor. And there is a pull factor. India is rich in opportunities, economic opportunities. You can certainly make investments that will be rational in India. You can't do the same everywhere. Plus, some of these countries, including some of the Saudi elite members, are now feeling the heat because of Daesh, because of ISIS. And if you want to develop an alternative brand of Islam, where else will you find the right type of Islam? This is the country of Sufi traditions. It's still there in Pakistan. It's even much more there in India. So you can certainly try to upgrade the alternative brand of Islam that Sufism is by relating to the country. And last but not least, again, and it's the push and the pull at the same time, again, remittances play a big role. There is an hyphen there. You can't de-hyphenate these two regions simply because you have billions of dollars transiting from one country or one set of countries to the other. But the list can be longer, I think.
So are you making the argument that what Saudi Arabia or maybe even the UAE in their outreach to India right now is basically a hedging strategy, a tactical one? It's not a fixed policy in terms of their view of India as a strategic partner.
It's too early to say indeed. You transition from a tactic to a strategy when you really establish some long-term and consistent decisions. For instance, it's not terribly consistent to ask Khalil Sharif to be the chief of IFMAT and make overtures to India. Raheel Sharif is certainly one of the chief of army staffs of Pakistan, which has initiated, you can say, anti-Indian moves. So how will that be received in New Delhi? I don't know, but we are still in the tactic.
What were the circumstances, do you think, that would convert what is essentially, as you said, a tactical situation into a strategic one? What would be required in the external environment to make Saudi Arabia, or at least the UAE, I'm not too sure the Indian system would be like to be that close to Saudi Arabia, make that a genuine relationship, a long-term relationship? What would be needed to change that?
Well, precisely, if we return to the list I gave in the beginning, investments which are not speculative, but in infrastructure, something that can be made, would create links, definitely, long-term kind of links. Some cultural interactions showing India in a different perspective, and the kind of meeting Prime Minister Modi organized on Sufism last year was certainly sending signals that have to be converted into concrete achievements now, but I think this soft power dimension can be part of the story. And thirdly, one of the questions that these countries are always asking is, how can we be safe? You know, the question of security. And India is building a navy. It will take some time, but by the end of this century, for sure, there'll be a blue navy in India. This navy is certainly one of the most important assets India has in this region between the Straits of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca. And for these countries to be able to rely on some support on that side would be, in that sense, strategic.
Right. Now, you've mentioned, you talked about the Islamic bomb, but in many ways that is the core. I mean, that is because it's nuclear. It's the heart of the Saudi-Pakistan relationship, which is that Saudi Arabia, as we basically know, has financed the growth of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, with the understanding that this arsenal would effectively be available to Saudi Arabia if Iran goes nuclear. And that's a bond that Saudi Arabia has no alternative other than Pakistan. So if, for example, President Trump decides to rip apart the US-Iranian nuclear deal, which he has threatened to, would that essentially mean that the Saudi-Pakistan relationship would revert back to what its original status is? Or is there any way that, from an Indian perspective, that you can actually de-hyphenate Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as long as you have this core nuclear relationship?
Well, again, I think it will be difficult for the Saudis to rely on Pakistan the same way they could say no for Yemen, which was a small issue comparatively. They will have probably to swallow one more no in the case of these nuclear devices. It's also why Pakistan has always two lions in his zoo. China is the alternative. You can fall back on some strong supporter on the east, because to give access to your nuclear assets. Now, certainly, we can have this suspicion because, for instance, in 1998, just after the test, Prince Turki, who was at the helm of the intelligence services at that time, was one of the few, probably the only foreigner to have access to Kauta, the installation of Aqi Khan, the father of the Pakistani bomb. So there are indications of this proximity, but to translate that into this is at your disposal, I don't see that happening.
I'll just give a small anecdote. I was once, many years ago, before King Abdullah, the last king of Saudi Arabia, as many of you may know, came to India in, forgotten, about 6, 7, 8 years ago as our Republic Day guest, and the first Saud in 50 years to visit India. I went to Saudi Arabia to interview King Abdullah, and at one point I was called in by the then Minister of Information in Saudi Arabia, and he said, let's understand this. There are certain questions you will not be allowed to ask. So he began listing them one by one. And then at one point he turned and he said, and do not ask about the Saudi-Pakistan nuclear relationship. And I said, why not? And he said, let's get this. We don't ask you about your nuclear relationship with Israel. You don't ask us about ours with Pakistan.
Both of you have it.
But ours with Israel is not strategic, it's technological. It's a slightly different state of affairs. But anyway, Iran. As you mentioned, Iran is the other force in this neighborhood, and is now, I would argue, becoming almost a source of paranoia with the Saudis, that they see this enormous Shia revival. As you've mentioned, they've seen Syria, which they thought the Shia government in Assad was about to fall, suddenly go into reverse. Yemen, the war has simply gone nowhere whatsoever other than get all the Yemenis to hate the Saudi Arabians. And in Iraq, the Islamic State is slowly being pushed back by a Shia-dominant regime. Iran is basically sitting there, in many ways you could almost say, watching all the cards fall in the right direction on the table. How much, as you said, Pakistan is looking at this, and so is India, but we are being wooed by the Sunni Emirates in the Gulf. We're maintaining a kind of relationship with Iran, but it's one that we've always found difficult to sustain because Iran. Where do you see Iran's calculations in all of this going right now?
Of course, the first episode that will have to be watched very closely is, will they survive Trump? Because, we can speculate about everything, but if they don't, then we may be back to square one. But if we are not, they have a bright future for sure. And they don't have to do much. Everybody is coming to them. The Europeans, maybe not the Americans this time, but the Chinese. So they will gradually rebuild their economy. They'll be a really important power in the region, making the Saudis even more paranoid. Which is not good because paranoids have no real policy. And the younger they are, the worse they can be. But of course, that will probably result in some intensification of ties with Pakistan, because if they really become a great, big regional economy again, if they are part of this One Belt, One Route program, already you have trains reaching Tehran from Beijing, so that will probably be seen by Pakistan as an opportunity. One more reason to turn to Iran. Because Pakistan needs energy, needs gas, and that's key for the economy.
Now, the Islamic military alliance that you've mentioned that Saudi Arabia is putting together should really be called a Sunni military alliance, because there are no Shia countries allowed in this alliance. And the basic understanding is if you join this alliance, you could argue there are Shia terrorist groups, but the primary goal of this organization is to counter Shia power. So as you mentioned, for Pakistan, having already had to face one problem or one crossroads when it came to involving itself in Yemen, to get involved in yet another one in which you try to bring together a really disparate number of countries. Turkey, which has really no liking at all whatsoever for Saudi Arabia, and have been at counter. They've attempted to build themselves as the Sunni leader of the world with an alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, which the Saudis detest. And then you have Egypt, which seems to be going back and forth as to who exactly it wants to back, and has recently had severe problems with Saudi Arabia. This military alliance, do you seriously see any bond in that other than Saudi money?
No, it's indeed a very eclectic assemblage and collage in a way. But symbolically, it can reassure the Saudis that, yes, they lead. They may be somewhat weak leaders. They may be leading from behind, as we've heard before. But with resources, it would be a symbolic achievement. Of course, now the problem will be what happens on the ground. And again, till they have not won in Yemen, they will not be, I would say, confident of their own survival. Another thing that is interesting is that it's to fight terrorism. That is officially the designation. And here, we are back to the Greek picture I mentioned before, because India saw that the Saudis sometimes means business in terms of fighting some Islamist groups. Abu Jundal has been extradited to India, and that's a signal that was sent. So we will have to see whether this alliance does more in that direction. And if Daesh is really a priority. Because for the moment it's very ambiguous. As you said, what is clear, it is a Sunni alliance. How far will they take care of the Sunni Islamists which are attacking Riyadh or other cities? By the way, the last attack in Jeddah last year was made by Pakistanis partly. So we are in this so complicated situation where these two countries support and oppose Islamists. And sometimes it bounces back. And then they have to find out who did it, and they have to select the group that has to be punished. But they will cultivate others. We may bounce back afterwards as well. And Pakistan has invented groups one after another because they lost control of them. You know, Arakat ul Ansar became Arakat ul Mujahideen and became Jaish-e-Mohammed, and you see, a succession of groups because you create the groups, you try to control them, but they lose, you lose control of them and they attack yourself. So these two countries are in this situation, and this alliance will only be, I would say, with some credit, if we see them systematically attacking or repressing and controlling these groups and their money and their finance, because that's key also.
But as you said, both countries, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, have a sense that they need Islamicism, that they need to have militant Islamic fighters. Saudi Arabia, because they feel they need that to counter Shia power. Pakistan, because they need to counter India. And as you said, they lose control of these organizations on a regular basis, who sometimes attack them, sometimes don't, but they never give up. And so are they basically in the spiral, which a dead-end trap, in which they keep continuing to believe that Islamic militancy is the only means to fight or to counter their number one enemy, so they're prepared to accept having a number two enemy. And the Islamic State in particular was a very interesting organization, because while it was a sort of an apocalyptic cult, it also played a very sensible geopolitical game. So it'd go to Turkey and say, you support us tacitly, and we'll go after the Kurds, who are your number one enemy. They go to the Saudis and say, you give us tacit support, and we'll go after the Shias, who's your number one enemy. And basically played off everybody and survived. Now, of course, they are crumbling because of Shia power more than anything else, and of course the Russian intervention in support of Shiism. Do you see any signs of even thinking in this part of the world, accepting that this is a cul-de-sac in which we are basically getting stuck into, and the Islamic State itself is the most extreme manifestation of what would happen if you continue down this path?
Before I respond, and it's a very good question, I would like to return to this policy of Turkey vis-à-vis Daesh, because it echoes the policy of Pakistan vis-à-vis the Afghan Islamists. You know, it's so interesting to see that in the 70s, Bhutto supported Hekmatyar, Rabbani, Massoud to fight the Pashtun nationalists. Yeah. No, they are their own Kurds, the Pashtun nationalists. And they built these groups, which of course became big after the anti-Soviet jihad, but they had started it before. And it bounced back because the Taliban are nothing but the sons of some of these groups. Now, the spiraling or the cyclical image you've used, I would qualify that by saying, yes, there is certainly a spiral, but sometimes it's getting... And I must say that Rahil Sharif, in that sense, has made more than Kayani, at least in the Fatah. You know, there is no denying that with invading, quote-unquote, North Waziristan, a decision Kayani should have made years before, Rahil Sharif really made one more step in the right direction and making the life more difficult for groups like the Haqqanis. Of course, they have just crossed over to Afghanistan, but that has resulted in less attacks on the Pakistani territory. You compare the situation in 2009 and the situation in 2015 or 16, there is a real difference. These groups have been taken care of. Not only these groups, but some Sunni militant groups, including Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. Both leaders have been decimated. You know, fake encounters is also there in Pakistan, and you don't wait for the trials to take place. So, yes, there is this, I would say, addiction to paramilitary action, use of proxies. But the list of the proxies you rely upon can be longer or shorter, and it has been reduced.
Before I turn to the audience, I'll just say once when Kayani came to power, when became the head of the Chief of Army Staff, I asked a Pakistani journalist, I said, Kayani versus Musharraf, what's the difference? He said, Musharraf was all action and no thinking. Kayani is all thinking and no action. So I now open the audience. Anybody have any questions? Okay. We have this gentleman here. We'll start with you.
Hi. I'd like to come back on the appointments of Rahil Sharif. You mentioned that in April 2015, it was a big shock in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Gulf states when Pakistan refused bluntly to contribute to that coalition in Yemen. But the same thing happened later on at the creation of that alliance on the 15th of December, same year. Pakistan, Lebanon, and Malaysia were the three countries who discovered, or said so, that they were part of an alliance they said they were not consulted about. Let's talk about Pakistan. Immediately after that, in January, Adel Jubeir, the foreign minister, went to Pakistan to no avail. A few days later, Mohammed bin Salman, the deputy crown prince and defense minister, went to Islamabad and Lahore. He just extracted from Rahil Sharif a nice statement about the protection of the Saudi territory, but no contribution to that coalition. So the feeling I have is that his appointment as a retired chief of state, is more like a compromise. That is, technically Pakistan is not part of this coalition, and still it contributes by lending one of its key military men. I'd like to have your opinion on that.
It is certainly not what Saudis wanted initially, but it's still symbolically quite a signal that would be sent to Iran. And that's what worries the Pakistani government these days. You know, when you look at all the statements by Pakistani ministers, they try to damage control. Khwaja Asif has repeatedly over the last 2 days said, we want unity within the Muslim world. We don't want to choose one against the other, because that's the fear they have, that it is interpreted as Pakistan taking side, the Saudi side in Iran. So it's not as much as what the Saudis wanted, but it's too much for Iran anyway.
Gentleman in the green shirt.
Thank you for your insights. So in this very dismal story that you shared, the only bit of optimism or hope was the resistance put forth by Sufism, or what is in Pakistan usually called as shrine culture now. So could you talk a little bit about that and what that resistance looks like? Because that's probably the only part in your talk which was about people's power and not power of nation states. Also, if you could connect that to your own work on the Ajmer Dargah right now.
Yes, unfortunately, you have to have a top-down approach when you deal with IR. So that's why the people are not there. But of course, you should not forget about them. And I wanted to factor them in via this cultural dimension. You know, what is, I find interesting is to see people going to the dargah still, in spite of blast, so many blasts, against very important shrines in Punjab, in South, everywhere. And not, I would say, only people from the peasantry, from the plebeians, but also middle-class people. You know, I emphasize this precisely in relation to my work on Ajmer, because the trend among Indian Muslims is, under the influence of Tabligh Jamaat or others, to say, don't go to Sufi saints places because this is superstition, this is irrational. The more educated you are, the less you go. Or if you go secretly. You don't tell, you don't say that you're going. So it's very important to emphasize this, so far as I can see, but it's only because I visited the places. Everybody continues to go, at least for Urs, at least for these kind of things. And it's indeed reconforting. Of course, Sindh is the place where it's even bigger. But it's there elsewhere as well. Yeah. Yeah.
My question is in the context that I've studied in Jeddah for 5 years on 2 installments when Nawaz Sharif was in Jeddah. Notwithstanding several postures and subtexts which are continues to be played out, the permanent relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan stands out as follows. The very concept of creation of Pakistan is to be anything which is minus India, and that means they have to look towards the very foundation of Islam, Saudi Arabia. And for Saudi Arabia, as they say, that other than the physical proximity between the couple, everything is to be outsourced. And therefore, this nuclear bomb issue is not a fuzzy issue. And I've interacted with the Saudi royalty and the various decision makers. There is a very strong possibility that bombs exist in airfields near Riyadh in the basement. And Saudis are no fool that on the basis of a promissory note they have been paid the money. There is a very, very strong possibility of bombs in the basements near Riyadh.
No,
this text supersedes all the posturings which are there. That means they are condemned to a permanent embrace, these 2 nations.
I beg to differ. I don't think this is that clear. And the way they resisted so many pressures to join the battlefield in Yemen, I think, is bearing testimony of this. By the way, I've not mentioned the number of visits after this but they met 12 times at the highest level. They kept discussing and nothing came out of it. Yes, Pakistan is everything minus India, but you don't need to turn to Saudi Arabia to be Pakistan against India. That's where I think the roots and the specificity of South Asian Islam is so important. When you look at history, and when you look at the importance of these Sufi saints for the making of Islam in the subcontinent, you realize that first, none of them went on Hajj, just zero. By the way, none of the Mughal emperors went on Hajj either. It's very interesting. Because India was a secret territory in itself. You did not need to go for Hajj because you can have pilgrimages next door somewhat. You go to Nizamuddin, you go to Ajmer, you go to so many other places. So this is a conception of Islam that is territorialized, independently of the roots of Islam. And incidentally, when you look at all these texts I have briefly referred to by Iqbal, by Jinnah, Liaquat Ali Khan, everybody has one goal in mind. We were dominant in this subcontinent. We want to be dominant again. And we don't look west for that. We don't need to look west for that. We may need to get something from the west, but from the east, from the north, from everywhere. And for years, they were not in this camp that the Saudis had built, and they may not be forever, except if there are bombs in Riyadh, that I don't know.
Gentleman in the white there, and then after that, this fellow in the black.
Thank you for this excellent exposition of the whole situation. One thing I think, whether it is deliberate or otherwise, you have avoided speaking about China, which has extremely strong presence in Pakistan. Approximately $40 billion over the next 15, 20 years, plus Gwadar to Kashgar, economic corridor, one belt, one road. How will China view this situation? There has been no reaction as such, at least in the media so far. How do you visualize it taking shape and its importance to India?
No, that's a very important point indeed, and I referred to it only briefly by saying that a rapprochement with Iran, a Pakistani rapprochement with Iran, would make sense for China because of this one route, one belt program, because of the proximity between Tehran and Beijing anyway. So that's certainly one of the factors that the Pakistani establishment will keep in mind before alienating Iran. Well, another variable that has to be taken care of is Afghanistan. Who can make peace in Afghanistan? That's something China is interested in because of the minerals, because of this one route, one belt program. Iran is probably a player that can promote the Chinese interest in Afghanistan more than the Saudis. And incidentally, there was a very interesting article in the New York Times recently saying that the Saudis had tried to be the peacemakers between Karzai and the Taliban in 2007, 2008. And those who interfered and sabotaged these talks were the Pakistanis, because they didn't want the Saudis to make peace in Afghanistan. So that's another factor. The third factor, of course, is Islamism. There is certainly another paranoia that is mounting in China, and that is the Islamist threat. When Uyghurs can do what they've done in Istanbul last month, it means that they are growing up. And you've seen recently attacks, repeatedly there are these fears of some Chinese Islamist Uyghur movement. The risk of Saudis being supporting, and I've not said Saudi Arabia, but the risk of Saudis supporting Islamists, even of that kind, is probably more real than the same thing coming from Iran. So that's not so important, but I want to mention that because it's certainly one of the factors that will be dictating the policy of the Chinese in the coming years.
Oh, about the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I'm part of track two dialogues we have with the Chinese. And one of the things that the Chinese have been very clear about is, at least when they talk to us in private, is that a large reason why they're going in to build a corridor is to stabilize Pakistan. Their argument is basically, yes, that the Americans are leaving, Pakistan is still a mess, and they are very, very nervous about the idea, as he's mentioned, about Uyghur terrorism, but not only just Uyghurs. The fact is that Islamic fundamentalism or conservatism is spreading into the other Chinese Muslim priorities like the Way and so on. And the Chinese, in my view, are making it worse by making them eat pork and forcing them to sell alcohol in the mosques and stuff like that, which is very Chinese, but they're making it much worse. And they have been, so their view is that as the Americans leave Afghanistan, the spillover effect of Afghanistan basically going back into another round of civil war and potentially Pakistan falling apart is that this will be enormously destructive to China. The point about China is that you look at China and you say the Muslims there are not never going to be able to threaten the Chinese state. But the Chinese state has a very low tolerance level. If they have even 2 people killed, the system goes completely catatonic. Forget about something on a 9/11 scale. It's simply, they can't even, but just having a small attack really is very difficult for them to absorb. And they're also baffled. They don't really get Islam at all. I went to a conference in Shanghai held by 4 of China's biggest think tanks on the issue of the future of West Asia or the Middle East. And they invited 2 Indians, but they invited Turks, Qataris, Jordanians, Iranians, so on, a few Americans. And they served pork in the main course at the dinner. I couldn't believe it. I had to warn the people at my table. I said, I hate to say that this is a pig. You can't eat this. And the Iranians got so terrified, they only ate the watermelon, and then they ran off to find a Domino's pizza outside. So the Chinese recognize, they've actually, when they've talked to us, they said, why don't you become more active in West Asia? And we'd be prepared to support you because the stability of West Asia is important to us, but we don't get these people. You have a strong historical, cultural link with them. So the corridor is there. I would argue the corridor is something like what the American Marshall Fund was. It's an experiment to see whether China, which has traditionally been very reluctant to put itself out in any enormous major way to stabilize any part of the world on its own. Can we do this experiment? And they're terrified. They really don't they've now repackaged the financing of the China-Pakistan economic corridor 3 times. It is now the biggest problem that we face, India faces with China, is that Chinese are furious that we will not endorse the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And India said, well, Modi has said, go ahead and build it, but we're not going to, how can we endorse something that goes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir? It's impossible. And the Chinese said, we've been told by the Pakistanis that you're going to sabotage this. And India said, we won't do anything. The Pakistanis are telling you nonsense. And the Chinese says, no, we know that this is a terrible sign from you. And it's now becoming more, and one of the reasons our relationship with China is going haywire is that we can't seem to get them to understand that this, and for Xi Jinping, this is his flagship international enterprise. He has put everything on stake on the One Belt, One Road, and within that said the flagship enterprise is the China-Pakistan corridor. In our military dialogues, the people who are most critical on the Chinese side are the PLA. The Chinese military is furious. They've said this is a ridiculous, they actually tell us behind closed doors, this is a ridiculous program. We are going to be trying to build a corridor in the most unstable, dangerous part of the world, where everybody we've turned to, World Bank, ADB, says you're out of your mind. You want to build through Baluchistan? Are you crazy? And then you want to build through, crazy parts, stuff that we would never even dream of. And the Chinese system is now getting more and more worked up about this. Now, they may succeed. Their problem is, again, the tolerance level. You can build this. You have the money, you have the capacity, you have the support of everybody in the Pakistani system, or at least those who matter. Your problem is, can you absorb losing, let's say, 50 workers being killed? And the answer is no. They can't. You may have seen that there was Mao Wei, a person I know very well, was the former consul general in Calcutta, issued a blog in December and said that China should reconsider blocking India's attempts to get a UN ban on Masood Azhar. Why? Because he was the deputy ambassador in Pakistan in 2007 when Chinese workers were killed by militants, Islamic militants. And I know Mao very well, and he said, that it's just ridiculous that we don't realize that this is a threat. But the Chinese now are walking on eggs on how to do this. And so the Indian side is unhappy with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but also believes that ultimately there's nothing we can do about it. But the Chinese now, the more and more they get into building the corridor, building bits and pieces of it are easy. You can build Gwadar port. But if you've been to Gwadar port, you realize it's a port that goes nowhere. I mean, it's not connected to anything. A container that arrives in Gwadar then gets onto a truck and goes 40 kilometers to Karachi port. So then everybody says, well, then why doesn't the ship just go to Karachi port in the first place? And that's exactly what happens. Singapore Port Authority ran Gwadar for, I think, 1.5 years. They lost $400 million. And I asked the Singaporeans, I said, why? Did you lose? He said, because one ship showed up in 6 months. So everybody's looking at the Gwadar port and saying, okay, the Chinese saying, okay, we'll build the connectivity. And everybody's looking at them, why are you building this? Because Karachi is right there. And now there's another interesting development, which the Japanese told me, is that in social media in China, there is growing criticism of the corridor, which is that why are we, Chinese, the Chinese are basically saying, I have a sewer outside my house that's leaking. Then why the hell are we building sewers in Pakistan? And the Chinese system is getting more and more nervous about this. For some reason, they take social media very seriously because they have no other means to judge public opinion. So the Silk Road Fund, which is the big wealth fund that is supposed to be financing part of the corridor, is now being told by the Chinese government, why don't you make the projects economically viable instead of just being strategically viable, the profits. And the Silk Road Fund it's impossible to make these economically viable. You can't build a port in Baluchistan and make it economically viable. There's simply not enough trade to make it any sense. So it's going to be interesting how the Chinese handle this, but they are getting caught in building a project which they've never done something on this scale that is so strategically large, and they haven't been able to explain to their own population and large portions of their own elite as to why this is important. And I'd be curious to see how this develops over the next 5 or 6 years. In particular, if they will, and I'm almost certain this is going to happen, somebody is going to gun down a lot of Chinese engineers and workers, because there's no way you can defend something this large. And the Pakistanis have raised one division, 16,000 men. That's nothing for a 1,400 kilometer long corridor. When the last time they tried to build Gwadar, if I remember correctly, 13 Chinese engineers were gunned down by Baluchis, who basically see a foreigner and they say, oh, let's kill him and see what happens. That's like a national sport there. And if we don't kill him, let's kidnap him and chop off ears and nose and send it off and see if we get any money back. And if it doesn't happen, we kill him anyway. So these guys, Chinese, are going into some really remarkable parts of the planet without having any idea how to handle this. So it's going to be an amazing test, broadly speaking, for me, it's a huge test of China's ability to actually be a superpower. Can they do it? I'm not even pretend that I even know the answer. But the more I talk with the Chinese, the more nervous my sense is that they are about what they're doing there. Fellow in the front here. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Just to build on what Pramit was saying earlier, you had mentioned that ISIS is a common target of both Pakistan as well as Saudi Arabia. So, but isn't that contradicting of what you said earlier, that if they want to build a militant state, why shouldn't they foster such groups? Is it something much more complex than the Shia versus Sunni episode, or is it that they really don't want to see like a minor group taking control of state interventions?
But this group, Daesh, wants to take all the power. So the question is not how do you support a group against another one. They will try to get it all. It's like what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis were, of course, dead against the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, that's why groups like Jamaat-e-Islami eventually distanced itself from the Saudis, in spite of Maududi being there in the 50s as one of the proteges of the Saudis. This is what I mentioned, an illustration of this good Islamist and bad Islamist. The good Islamists are those you can use for your purpose. The problem is that they may become bad because they may have their own agenda after some time. With ISIS, it's very clear. The agenda is already there. They don't want the establishment that is ruling, in fact, in both countries and many others, to stay in place. So why should they be supported?
Well, okay, go ahead, so we can hear you.
No, my question is that you are not taken into this. This is a dynamic situation now. Trump has taken over there. US has got petroleum fields that don't need Saudi Arabia, and $1 billion petrodollars and all that is there. China is now getting strong. Our bank is now there. Maybe that dollar may not be that permanent currency. There things are changing, and in that my particular end, that they said that Balochistan, they didn't want to interfere. Now, but with Trump coming in, and half of the Pakistan is Balochistan. So, and this economic organization doesn't make any sense except that they want to make a pearl, with, I don't know what they want to do, the hegemony.
So what is the question is? Okay, it's a comment. Okay, we'll end with that. That's a big geopolitical story. We thank you. Today we've covered quite a lot of material, and we could probably kept going on for at least 2 or 3 more days. And especially in something like the Saudi Arabian-Pakistan relationship, as with all relationships, I would argue now in the West Asian, North African sphere, keeps changing. So we could probably hold this next year at the same time and have a completely different set of comments by the two of us. Thank you.
So we invite you both to come back next year. Christophe, do we have a book coming out of this?
Yes.
Okay. When do you think you're finished? Next year?
Oh, the book is finished. I'm writing the introduction. It's on the relations between the South Asian countries and the West Asian countries.
Okay, very interesting. So you know what you'll be coming back for. So, but very many thanks. I think this is Christophe's, I think it's your 3rd or your 4th appearance at the Asia Society.
Fourth at least.
4th. And so he's got a standing invitation to come annually to the Asia Society in India and speak. And it's always such a pleasure to have him here. And Pramit, of course, I think this is his 4th or 5th or 6th, I don't know.
Depends on which of the Asia Societies.
Yeah, I know. He's been to all of them because he's really closely associated with the Asia Society. So thank you for joining us this evening. But I think what's interesting is, at least I learned a lot this evening, and because this is an area I think not well covered or not as well known as the India-American relationship, etc. So thank you for educating and enlightening us this evening. And some of our partners, SOSPO alumni, King's College alumni, Cornell University alumni, Global Youth Mumbai, and they did the outreach for the program. And we have a wonderful program coming up with Timothy O'Shea, who's Vice Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, on 17th of January. And then we have a stellar performance, but I believe there are no more tickets available, which is very unfortunate because with the Aga Khan Global Music Initiatives, these musicians from Central Asia, on the 28th, upper balcony, 15 of them I think are left. So go home and get online because it's a performance not to be missed. It's at the beautiful newly restored Opera House. And so we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.